In the winter of 1215, an envoy from the Khwarazmian Empire stood outside the walls of Chengdu, the capital of the Jin Dynasty. What he saw was not a city, but a monument to systematic annihilation. The ground was coated in a grease so thick horses slipped upon it. It was the rendered fat of tens of thousands of human bodies. Mountains of bleached white bones stretched toward the horizon, and the air carried the sickly sweet stench of decay and burning timber. This was not a natural disaster. It was a calculated, deliberate erasure of a civilization. A single military machine had descended upon the most fortified city on earth and reduced it to ash. This was the work of the Mongol army. To understand how the largest contiguous land empire in human history was forged, we must strip away the myths of mindless barbarians. This was a sophisticated, ruthless syndicate of conquest, a cartel of warlords born from the most unforgiving geography on the planet. The Eurasian steppe is an ocean of grass, swept by freezing winds and baking suns. Here, survival was not a right, it was a daily war. In this environment, weakness was an immediate death sentence, and from this frozen, violent crucible, the deadliest architect of human destruction was born. He was born with a blood clot in his fist, a dark omen for a dark century. His name was Temujin, translating to blacksmith or iron. The year was roughly 1162. His father, Yesuge, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, but in the steppe, titles held no weight against treachery. When Temujin was 9, his father was poisoned by a rival tribe, the Tartars, during a supposedly peaceful meal. The clan, refusing to follow a child, abandoned Temujin, his mother Hoylan, and his siblings to the harsh Mongolian winter. They were stripped of their herds, their protection, and their dignity. This was a psychological breaking point that would define the boy. Hunted by rivals, surviving on roots, wild dogs, and mice, Temujin learned the absolute necessity of ruthlessness. When his older half-brother Bekta attempted to usurp control of the starving family by stealing a single fish, Temujin did not argue. He and his brother Hasar stalked Bekter through the tall grass and executed him with arrows. There was no room for internal division. Temujin realized early that trust was a liability, and loyalty could only be guaranteed by absolute power. The seeds of the empire were sown in the blood of his own family. Temujin's adolescence was spent in captivity, wearing a wooden kang around his neck, a prisoner of the rival Taichud tribe. But captivity only sharpened his intellect. He studied the fractures in steppe society. The tribal system was a chaotic web of aristocratic privilege and endless blood feuds. Upon escaping, Temujin began to attract followers, not by birthright, but by charisma and shared suffering. He offered a radical proposition, a meritocracy of violence. If you fought well, you were rewarded, regardless of your bloodline. This attracted the outcasts, the broken, and the brilliant. He forged a blood brotherhood with Jamuka, a charismatic aristocrat, but their visions for the future collided violently. Jamuka believed in the traditional elite. Temujin believed in loyalty to himself above all. The resulting civil war was brutal. Temujin dismantled the old order methodically. When he defeated a rival tribe, he did not merely enslave the survivors, he executed the aristocratic leaders and absorbed the commoners into his own ranks, scattering them among different units to break their old tribal loyalties. He was not just winning wars, he was socially engineering a new nation. By 1206, the civil wars were over. The steppe was silent, unified under one man. At a massive council called a Kurultai, the unified tribes raised Temujin upon a white felt blanket and granted him a new title, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. But Genghis Khan did not rest on this victory. He knew that an army bred for war would consume itself if it had no external enemies. He completely restructured Mongol society, stripping away the very concept of the tribe. He divided his people into a strict decimal system, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. The 10,000, the two men, became the ultimate fighting division. If one man in a unit of 10 ran from battle, the other 9 were executed. This bred an unbreakable, terrifying cohesion. Furthermore, he instituted the yasa, a strict code of law that governed everything from the butchering of animals to the punishment for theft. The penalty for almost every crime was death. The Mongol nation was no longer a collection of nomads. It was a single, hyper-disciplined military organism, completely loyal to the Khan, and it was looking outward. The first true test of this newly forged weapon was the Western Xia Dynasty, located in modern-day northwestern China. The Xia were wealthy, controlling lucrative routes of the Silk Road and protected by vast fortified cities. The Mongols were masters of open-field cavalry warfare, but they knew nothing of sieges. They had no catapults, no battering rams. When Genghis Khan led his army against the Xia capital, he faced impenetrable stone walls. But the defining trait of the Mongol war machine was not just brutality, it was extreme adaptability. Recognizing their deficiency, the Mongols captured Chinese engineers. They weaponized the environment itself. In a terrifying display of logistical power, they attempted to divert the Yellow River to flood the Xia capital. While the initial attempt flooded their own camp due to a lack of engineering experience, the sheer audacity of the tactic broke the Xia's psychological resolve. The Xia emperor surrendered, offering tribute and submitting to Mongol vassalage. Genghis Khan had learned a crucial lesson. Fortifications were not obstacles, they were simply puzzles waiting to be cracked, and he had just acquired the engineers to crack them. To the east lay the Jin Dynasty, the true superpower of the region, boasting an army of millions and a network of fortresses stretching across northern China. The Jin emperors viewed the Mongols as mere nuisances. Genghis Khan saw the Jin as an existential threat and a source of limitless plunder. In 1211, the Mongol war machine crossed the Great Wall. The Jin expected a chaotic barbarian raid. Instead, they faced highly coordinated columns moving with terrifying speed, communicating via an intricate system of signal fires and flags. The Mongols did not engage the massive Jin armies in head-on battles. They feigned retreats, drawing the heavily armored Jin cavalry into traps, where they were slaughtered by precise horse archers. By 1215, Genghis Khan had encircled Zhengdu, the Jin capital. Rather than storming the massive walls, he sealed the city completely. He weaponized starvation. Inside the city, order collapsed. Cannibalism ran rampant. When the city finally fell, the massacre was total. The streets ran with the blood of the Jin aristocracy. The Mongol army stripped the city of its wealth, its artisans, and its dignity, leaving behind the mountains of bones that would shock the world. With northern China heavily subjugated, Genghis Khan turned his eyes west. He desired trade, not war, with the powerful Khwarazmian Empire, an Islamic superpower spanning modern-day Iran, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a massive, wealthy trade caravan to the Khwarazmian border city of Otrar. The local governor, driven by greed and paranoia, seized the caravan and slaughtered the merchants, accusing them of espionage. Genghis Khan, showing uncharacteristic restraint, sent 3 ambassadors to the Khwarazmian Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, demanding the governor be handed over for punishment. The Shah's response was an act of supreme arrogance. He shaved the beards of 2 ambassadors and beheaded the 3rd, sending the head back to the Khan. It was the greatest diplomatic miscalculation in human history. Genghis Khan went to a sacred mountain, removed his hat, untied his belt, and prayed to the eternal blue sky for 3 days. When he descended, the order was given. The Mongol army would not merely defeat Khwarezm, they would erase it from the face of the earth. The invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire was a masterpiece of military terror. The Shah, expecting a frontal assault, spread his massive armies across his fortified cities. Genghis Khan instead unleashed a multi-pronged phantom assault. He marched an army across the supposedly impassable Kizil-Kum desert, appearing instantly behind enemy lines. The Khwarazmian defense was paralyzed. Otrar, the city where the merchants were killed, was besieged. The governor was captured alive. According to historical accounts, his punishment for blinding himself with greed was having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. The Mongol army moved like a dark tide. Samarkand and Bukhara, the jewels of the Islamic world, were surrounded. The Mongols used a horrific tactic. They drove captured civilians ahead of their siege engines, forcing the city defenders to slaughter their own people before they could engage the Mongols. When Bukhara fell, Genghis Khan gathered the surviving elites in the Great Mosque and delivered a chilling proclamation. "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The psychological warfare escalated as the Mongols pushed deeper. Cities that surrendered immediately were spared and heavily taxed. Cities that resisted were subjected to total extermination. At the city of Nishapur, a Mongol prince, the son-in-law of Genghis Khan, was killed by a stray arrow. The retribution was absolute. The order was given that not a single living creature should remain. The inhabitants were dragged out onto the plains and beheaded. Even the dogs and cats in the streets were slaughtered to ensure the city was truly dead. To prevent survivors from hiding among the dead, the Mongols severed the heads of the victims and built massive, grotesque pyramids of skulls, one for men, one for women, and one for children. At the siege of Urgench, the fighting was so fierce it devolved into bloody house-to-house urban warfare. Frustrated by the resistance, the Mongols diverted the Amu Darya River directly into the city, wiping it from the map completely. The Khwarazmian Empire, a superpower of millions, was completely dismantled in less than 3 years. While Genghis Khan oversaw the destruction of Khwarazm, 2 of his greatest generals, Subutai and Jebe, asked for permission to conduct a reconnaissance mission further west. What followed was the longest cavalry raid in military history. With just 20,000 men, they swept through the Caucasus Mountains, obliterating Georgian armies, and spilled into the steppes of modern-day Ukraine and Russia. In 1223, a massive coalition of Kievan Rus princes and Cuman warriors, numbering roughly 80,000, marched out to crush this small Mongol force. At the Battle of the Kalka River, Subutai executed a perfect feigned retreat, drawing the overconfident Rus army out for 9 grueling days. Once the Rus lines were stretched and exhausted, the Mongols wheeled around and unleashed hell. The heavy Rus cavalry was decimated. The captured Rus princes were subjected to a uniquely Mongol execution. Because Mongol law forbade the spilling of royal blood on the ground, the princes were laid flat and heavy wooden floorboards were placed over them. The Mongol generals then held their victory banquet on top of the boards, slowly crushing the princes to death as they celebrated. By 1227, Genghis Khan was in his 60s. He was engaged in a final punitive campaign against the Western Shah, who had rebelled against his rule. During the campaign, the architect of the greatest empire on earth fell from his horse. His health deteriorated rapidly. Knowing his end was near, he summoned his sons and laid out clear instructions for the succession and the final destruction of the Shah. In August of 1227, Genghis Khan took his last breath. His death was treated as the ultimate state secret. A funeral procession carried his body back to the heart of Mongolia. To ensure the location of his grave would never be disturbed, the escorting soldiers slaughtered every human being and animal they encountered along the journey. Once the grave was dug and the Khan was buried, thousands of horses were trampled over the ground to erase any physical trace of the disturbed earth. The soldiers who performed the burial were then executed by another unit, who were in turn executed upon their return. The resting place of the great wolf was swallowed by the steppe, remaining an unsolved mystery to this day. The empire did not fracture upon Genghis Khan's death. He had wisely chosen his third son, Ogadai, as his successor, prioritizing a calm, pragmatic mind over the fiery military genius of his other sons. Ogadai officially took power in 1229. He understood that you can conquer an empire on horseback, but you cannot govern it from the saddle. Ogadai commissioned the building of a permanent capital, Karakoram, in the Orkhon Valley. He established a sophisticated postal relay system, the Yam, which allowed messengers to travel hundreds of miles a day, connecting the vast territories. He formalized taxation and built a massive bureaucracy fueled by the administrators of conquered nations. But this administrative focus did not mean an end to the violence. The Mongol war machine required constant fuel. Ogadai directed his forces to finally extinguish the Jin Dynasty in China, a brutal campaign that culminated in 1234. With the East secured, Ogadai turned his gaze to the unfinished business in the West. He ordered the largest army yet assembled to march toward the heart of Europe. In 1236, an invasion force of roughly 130,000 men, commanded by Batu Khan and the brilliant strategist Subutai, crossed the Volga River. Their target was the principalities of Kievan Rus. The Rus princes, deeply divided by internal squabbles, failed to mount a united defense. The Mongols utilized a terrifying strategy: winter warfare. While European armies traditionally stopped fighting when the snow fell, the Mongols used frozen rivers as massive highways, allowing them to move their siege equipment and cavalry at terrifying speeds directly to the walls of unsuspecting cities. In December 1237, the city of Ryazan was surrounded. After a 6-day siege, the city was breached and the slaughter was absolute. Chronicles report that not a single person was left alive to mourn the dead. City after city fell: Vladimir, Suzdal, and finally the crown jewel, Kiev. In 1240, Kiev was reduced to smoking rubble. The centralized power of the Rus was broken entirely, plunging the region into a state of vassalage known as the Tartar yoke that would last for over 2 centuries. Having pulverized Eastern Europe, the Mongols stood on the borders of the fragmented kingdoms of Central Europe. In 1241, Subutai orchestrated a multi-pronged invasion that showcased a level of strategic coordination unseen in Europe since the Roman Empire. The Mongol forces split. One wing swept north into Poland to prevent them from aiding their southern neighbors. At the Battle of Legnica, a coalition of Polish knights, Templars, and Teutonic knights was lured into a trap and annihilated by Mongol light cavalry and smokescreens. As proof of their victory, the Mongols severed one ear from every dead European, filling 9 large sacks. Meanwhile, the main Mongol force confronted the heavily armored army of King Bela IV of Hungary at the Battle of Mohi. The Hungarians established a fortified camp of wagons, believing themselves secure. Subutai simply surrounded the camp with catapults and bombarded it with rocks and Greek fire. When the terrified Hungarians fled through an intentional gap in the Mongol lines, they were hunted down mercilessly over a span of 30 miles. In a matter of days, the premier armies of Europe ceased to exist. The road to the Atlantic Ocean was now completely open. There was no standing army in Western Europe capable of stopping Subutai's war machine. The Holy Roman Empire prepared for the end of days. Coastal towns in England ceased fishing operations in sheer panic. But the apocalypse never arrived. In the winter of 1241, an exhausted messenger arrived at the Mongol camp in Central Europe, carrying the Yam passport of urgency. The message was brief but world-shattering. Ogedai Khan was dead. According to Mongol law, all princes of the blood and senior commanders were required to return to the capital of Karakoram to elect a new great Khan. Batu Khan and Subutai, standing on the precipice of total European conquest, turned their armies around and rode back east. Western Europe was not saved by its steel, its faith, or its castles. It was saved by the sudden death of an alcoholic man thousands of miles away in the Mongolian steppe. The Mongol tide receded, leaving behind traumatized nations and a chilling realization of their own utter vulnerability. The death of Ogedai triggered a dangerous period of instability. The empire was ruled by regents for a decade, as the bloodlines of Genghis Khan maneuvered for ultimate control. Eventually, power shifted from the lineage of Ogedai to the lineage of Tolui, Genghis's youngest son. In 1251, Mongke Khan ascended to the throne. Mongke was a harsh, puritanical ruler, determined to restart the engine of world conquest. He dispatched his brother, Kublai, to conquer the remnants of the Song dynasty in southern China, and his other brother, Hulagu, to bring the Middle East to heel. Hulagu's target was the Islamic world, specifically the Abbasid Caliphate. Along the way, Hulagu faced the legendary Nizari Ismailis, known to the West as the Hashashin, or assassins. Operating from impregnable mountain fortresses like Alamut, the assassins had terrified Middle Eastern rulers for centuries. Hulagu methodically dismantled their network. Using massive Chinese siege crossbows and heavy bombardment, he cracked Alamut open. The terrifying cult of assassins was exterminated down to the last man. The road to Baghdad was clear. Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, was the cultural and scientific heart of the Islamic world. In 1258, Hulagu demanded the Caliph al-Mustasim submit and tear down his walls. The Caliph, believing the entire Muslim world would rise to defend him, refused. It was a fatal misjudgment. Hulagu laid a brutal siege to the city. Within 2 weeks, the defenses crumbled. What followed was one of the most devastating cultural atrocities in human history. The Mongols unleashed a torrent of violence upon Baghdad. The Grand Library of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, was destroyed. Centuries of astronomical, medical, and philosophical texts were thrown into the Tigris River. It is said the river ran black with the ink of scholars and red with the blood of the citizens. To execute the caliph without spilling his royal blood on the earth, Hulagu ordered him rolled into a heavy carpet and trampled to death by horses. The destruction of Baghdad effectively ended the Islamic Golden Age. The center of the world had been hollowed out. Hulagu prepared to push into Egypt, but history repeated itself. News arrived that Mongke Khan had died in China. Hulagu was forced to withdraw the bulk of his army to deal with the impending succession crisis, leaving behind a small garrison of 10,000 men under the command of his general, Kitbuka. The Mamluks of Egypt, an elite caste of slave soldiers who were highly disciplined and familiar with steppe warfare, saw their opportunity. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut in modern-day Israel, the Mamluks lured the Mongol vanguard into an ambush. For the first time since the rise of Genghis Khan, a Mongol army was definitively crushed in open battle, and the advance was permanently halted. The aura of Mongol invincibility was shattered. But the true death blow to the unified empire was internal. The Toluid civil war erupted between Kublai Khan and his brother Arik Bok over the title of Great Khan. The empire officially fractured into 4 distinct, often hostile territories: the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty. Kublai Khan emerged victorious from the civil war, but his focus shifted almost entirely to China.
He established the Yuan dynasty and finally conquered the southern Song, uniting China under foreign rule for the first time. Kublai transformed from a steppe warlord into a Chinese emperor, ruling from a spectacular new capital, Khan Balik, modern-day Beijing. He craved the prestige of total regional domination. He looked across the sea to Japan, demanding their submission. When the Kamakura shogunate refused and beheaded his envoys, Kublai launched massive amphibious invasions in 1274 and 1281. The 1281 invasion fleet was one of the largest in history, carrying nearly 140,000 troops. But the ocean was a domain the Mongols could not control. As the Mongol fleet prepared to assault the Japanese mainland, a massive typhoon struck the coast. The hastily constructed, flat-bottomed riverboats of the Mongol fleet were smashed to pieces. Hundreds of thousands drowned. The Japanese called this miraculous storm the kamikaze, the divine wind. It was a stark reminder that the Mongol war machine had absolute limits.
The unified Mongol Empire was dead, but its fragments shaped the modern world. The immense violence of the conquests eventually gave way to the Pax Mongolica, a century of unprecedented peace and free trade across the Eurasian landmass. For the first time, a merchant could travel from Italy to China with absolute security, carrying a golden passport of safe conduct. The Silk Road flourished. Gunpowder, the compass, and printing technology flowed into Europe, accelerating the Renaissance. But the arteries of trade also carried a microscopic killer. The fleas carrying Yersinia pestis traveled along these secure Mongol routes, eventually triggering the Black Death, which would wipe out tens of millions across Europe and Asia. The empire evaporated, absorbed by the cultures they conquered, but their invisible fingerprints remain. Genghis Khan reshaped the demographics of the planet. Geneticists estimate that nearly 16 million men alive today carry his Y chromosome. The Mongols were the ultimate disruptors. They burned the old world to ash, and in that ash, the seeds of the deeply connected, globalized modern world were forcibly planted.